Good evening to all of you here in Haus Marion, nearby the Goetheanum. Thank you very much for joining. And good evening or good morning, wherever you are, for those who are with us from somewhere else. Today we will continue our series of lectures given by the General Anthroposophical section on the Hebrew humanism. And this year, in 2024, we already had lectures about Margarete Sussman, about Franz Kafka, and about Paul Celan. We had an evening about Paul Celan. And today we would go into the work and the life of Gershom Scholem. And first I will say some words, or I will try a little contribution about one of his main topics of research, or one of his many topics of research, we should say. And then Peter Selg would talk about him, about the environment in which he lived, and about the situations he met, and will bring that until the days of today. And I would like to start with a consideration about the relation of Gershom Scholem with his own research work. So he was born in the 5th of December of 1897, and very young he started studying Hebrew, and very young also he started to become a researcher on the Jewish heritage, we can say. And he went into many topics also of the Kabbalah wisdom. And he says that he went into a realm of research that in a certain sense was very expecting to be worked out. Everything was mixtures, the texts, the old texts, many things have not been translated, even translated at that point. And he went through all that, translations, finding documents, bringing them together, and giving to that really a kind of a shape so that it's then prepared, so to say, for the others to understand the becoming of these ideas, of this transformation on different topics of this huge world of the Jewish tradition, of the Kabbalistic text and tradition. And he did it in such a way that we can say that after him, this whole Kabbalah wisdom and the old Jewish wisdom, in many senses, had an entrance into the realm of academic knowledge. And coming from most or many of these texts from a more religious, cultural religious tradition, often also an oral tradition, he brought this written text, translated from Aramaic, from Yiddish, from Hebrew, in such a way that they could now be part of a corpus, of a shape in academic knowledge, and also in so far built a base for further discoveries, for further research, for further knowledge. And on one hand he did that in a very objective way, we would say, as people used to deal with questions in science, and also with these methods that the human sciences learned and, in a certain sense, took over from natural sciences. This objectivity in descriptions and in dealing with this knowledge. But at the same time, we can see many years later, and authors research that, how deeply he was personally connected to all this wisdom. He had a deep connection to many of these texts, of these topics he was working with. And one of the things that he researched deeply was the topic or the theme of the creation out of nothing. And this will be today the topic that I would like to describe a little bit. The idea that God created the world, the human being, the whole reality out of nothing. And he went deep into this topic, how it evolved in the three monotheistic religions, how it evolved especially in the Jewish tradition. And one of the expressions of this topic of the creation out of nothing was what we know as the Tzimtzam, the creation of God out of nothing, as it was taught and received in the Kabbalistic knowledge in the 13th century and then later on in the 16th century. And he was deeply connected to that. He was deeply connected also personally to this idea. And we can see this deep connection as an example in a moment when he spoke in the occasion of the traditional Jewish commemoration or remembrance after 30 days after the death, in this case of Franz Rosenzweig. In 1930, Franz Rosenzweig was also one of those who we spoke about in the series of lectures in the General Anthroposophical section. And when he died, 30 days later, Gershom Scholem spoke about him in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he was a professor, as we will hear later. And at that point, he describes in a very strong and precise way that the figure of God that was a central figure in the main work of Franz Rosenzweig in the 20th century, in a certain sense, vanished from the consciousness, vanished from the possibility to be reached. And he says that he vanished, the presence of God vanished into two realms. On one hand, he says, in psychology, and on the other hand, it vanished into sociology. And instead of a relation of the soul with God, the soul was described as a topic to be understood in psychology and in sociology. And he says that in a very precise way in this speech, and I would like to quote it briefly. In sociology and in psychology, the concerns of deity and the concerns of the human being, the eternal themes of theology, took on profane worldly forms. It is obvious then that the themes of theology have become invisible in these generations of ours, hidden lights that sent their light inwards and were not recognized outside. The God who was driven away from human being in psychology and from the world in sociology no longer wanted to dwell in the heavens of all places, surrendered the throne of strict judgment to dialectical materialism and the throne of loving compassion to psychoanalysis, shrouded himself in mystery and does not reveal himself anymore. Does he really not reveal himself? Thus his revelation perhaps lies precisely in this extreme self-entanglement. Perhaps the disappearance of God to the point of nothingness was of higher necessity and will only reveal his kindship to a world that is emptied according to the scripture. I let myself, by by those who did not ask, and let myself be found by those who did not seek me. And this is the wasteland from where the star of redemption appeared to Franz Rosenzweig. So he says that in a certain sense, God goes away into a nothingness in this 20th century. Maybe as a historical necessity, and in this place, going out from the reality in a certain sense, going a step back, he says, maybe there is the place where we can again reach God. Yeah, and in the end, or a little bit more further in his speech, in his memorial speech to Franz Rosenzweig, he will say, the nothingness of God is the only form of experiencing God that is currently still possible in the disenchanted world. The nothingness of God is the only form of experiencing God that is currently still possible. Yeah, so he was deeply connected. We can see that in this speech, but also in letters, deeply connected to this topic. And the lecture in which he describes this topic of creation out of nothing is called Creation Out of Nothing and God's Self-Limitation. This lecture was published in 1957, and this lecture was given in the Eranos meetings in Ascona. And the idea that he describes there, and I will quote different parts of this lecture that then he transformed in a book, in a written text. What he describes there is that for the myth, for the mythological view, God always creates out of something. There is a chaos, maybe there is a big water, maybe there is the coming together of gods that love them in love. There's always something. Out of that, God can create the world. And also in the Greek philosophy, if we look to Aristotle or if we look to Plato, both, they describe creation as a process of ordering the substance that have been there before. So in Plato's Timaeus, the demiurge clearly is ordering the substances. There was substance before, always existing. And what he did was to order, to shape, to give form. And he says that this idea of a creation out of nothing is for Christianity and for the Islam and for Judaism a doctrine of creation that came after the basic doctrines and the official theology in all three monotheistic religions. So he says, if we look to the beginnings of the documents about the creation, what is there is a creation as ordering, as shaping, and not a creation out of nothing. And only after, he says, we can find first appearances of documents, of narratives speaking about this creation out of nothing. Yeah. This creation out of nothing later will be also included in the beliefs of the Catholic Church. And it will be in the 19th century that it will really enter in the Catholic Church through a concilium, when the decision is there to have this narrative that God created the whole creation, the whole world out of nothing. And he says that many texts, if we look back to the text in which we can find the beginnings of this narrative of a creation out of nothing, he says, it's also not so easy to affirm when it really started. Because he says, in the different translations of the documents, it's very open in which way the documents should or could be interpreted. And there we see he's really going through a process of objective research. He is looking to the different texts in Aramaic, to the text in Hebrew, comparing them and saying it could be understood in that way, but also in another way. And what he says is, we can say that the first moment in which a Jewish text appears with this idea of God creating out of nothing is in the second book of the Maccabees. And he says that this was also the base then in the Christian belief to speak, after that, to speak about a creation out of nothing. And this is the story of the Maccabees, of these brothers in war, and they are captured and they are tortured in front of their mother. They are tortured and then they are killed by the enemy. And the mother is there witnessing all that. And when the last child, the youngest one, is also tortured and they want him to deny his Jewish belief, the mother will say, I beg you, my child, look to the heaven and to the earth and see all that is in them. And remember that God created this out of nothing, and that the human being also became like this. And he says there are also other texts in which we read, know that he did not make heaven and earth out of things that exist. And so we see these are different approaches. But he says that the passage that the first Latin translation affirmed speaks then about this, created out of nothing. Remember that God created this out of nothing. Yeah. And what then he describes is that for the three monotheistic religions, this idea that starts to be born, that starts to enter in the narratives of a creation out of nothing, brought the necessity to transform, to have a reinterpretation that brought big challenges, because the whole doctrine needed to be reinterpreted. And this is something very interesting, because many times we think, well, Judaism or the Christian belief has been all the time as we know it today. But it went into deep processes of transformation, of reinterpretation, of changes out of the different narratives that came together, melded together, and it was always a process of construction. Another very important text for the idea of God who creates out of nothing goes back to Basilides. Basilides, who lived in the 1st century after the Christian time. He was agnostic in Alexandria, and it's very possible that he knew the Gospel of St. John at this time, And he spoke about something that then one of his pupils, his students, Hippolytus of Rome, wrote down. And what we know is the text of Hippolytus. And I would like to read a passage of this text. So it's Hippolytus of Rome writing that what he learned with Basilides. Now, when nothing existed, neither substance nor essence, nor insubstantiality, nor simplicity, nor composition, nor incomprehensibility, neither human being, nor angel, nor God, nor anything at all nameable that can be perceived by feeling or understanding, but rather when everything was absolutely non-existent in the most real sense, the non-existent God decided to create the world without thought, without sensation, without reason, without plan, without passion, without desire, without feeling. And when I say he willed, I say, for the sake of comprehension, he willed without will and without thought. And by saying the world, I do not mean that which later come into being and diverge through expansion and separation, but I mean the world seed. The world seed contained everything within itself, just as the mustard seed contains everything summarized in the smallest, the roots, the stem, the branches, the innumerable leaves and the seeds to be produced by the plant and all further developing plants and their seeds. Thus, the non-existent God created a non-existent world from non-existent things by bringing forth a seed that contained the entire seed of the world. The non-existent God created a non-existent world from non-existent things by bringing forth a seed that contained the entire seed of the world. And we can sense how we go in this description, in a certain sense, to a limit of the imaginable. And this is this creation out of nothing. And the idea of this creation out of nothing was transmitted, and Gershom Scholem describes in which way it reached as an example very deeply and transformed the thought and the thinking of, as an example, Meister Eckhart and especially Jakob Böhme. And then he describes that there was also a stream of thinking, of tradition, of narrative, in which the idea of this creation out of nothing played a huge role. And this was in the Kabbalah as it first appeared in Spain, in Catalonia, in Girona, around 1220, in the 13th century. And there is this conception of the will as the nothingness of all creation. And then there is this historical moment, 1492, in which the Jewish people and the Jewish villages and all the Jews who were living in Spain needed to go away from Spain. They are expelled from Spain, and with that we see the beginning of this diaspora in many places around Europe, also Eastern Europe, to Holland, to many other places. And also a diaspora of people going then to Palestine. And we will see again this arising of the learnings of Kabbalah in the 16th century in Galilee, in the heights. And there we will see this new approach of this Kabbalistic wisdom in Safed, as I said, in Upper Galilee. And this appears there with a person, with a teacher, we can say with a leader of this Kabbalistic thought, Isaac Luria. And Gershom Scholem was one who really brought the knowledge about Isaac Luria in a very, very precious way. Isaac Luria, he was born in Jerusalem in 1534, but he lived and worked in Safed, and there he studied the Zohar, this main work of medieval Spanish Kabbalah, written in the 13th century, and he was a pupil of Moshe Cordovero. This was a very important teacher in the Kabbalah. And after his death, after the death of his teacher, Luria began to teach himself to a very close circle of students. And his teaching was mostly oral, and one of his main students, Chaim Vital, wrote down and transcribed then the teachings of Isaac Luria, even though it was prohibited. And we can say that thanks to the writings of Chaim Vital, these teachings could then become something that people could reach. And I would like to read shortly here what Scholem writes about this emergence and the spread out of the lyric doctrine connected to this expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. And in his book, The Jewish Mystic, in his mainstreams, first published 1957, he writes, "The year 1492, after the expulsion from Spain, marked a complete change in the history of the Kabbalah. A catastrophe of such magnitude, which affected one of the most important branches of the Jewish people, was bound to leave the deepest impression on all areas of Jewish life and feeling. It immediately became apparent that the Kabbalah was the power that had the greatest vitality in this decisive epoch, and that it quickly transformed itself from an esoteric teaching for the few into a popular movement. The main effects and consequences of the catastrophe of 1492 did not materialize immediately. Rather, the great historical process triggered by the Spanish expulsion took several generations, indeed almost a whole century, to reach its fullest and most visible realization. Gradually, the awareness of the violence of the event sunk into ever deeper layers. This process led to an ever-increasing connection between the messianic and the apocalyptic elements of Judaism and those of the ancient Kabbalah. The last days and the path to them become just as important as the first. Instead of going back to the primordial beginning before all history or to its metaphysical preconditions, Now it is necessary to storm the final stage of the cosmological process. The pathos of the Messianic pervades the entire modern Kabbalah, but especially the most classical of its systematic forms, in a completely different way than could be said for the Kabbalah of the Zohar before. The beginning and the end of the world process are connected in a profound way by the new Kabbalists. Thus, the intention of the Never Kabbalah to work on the whole, the community, in order to prepare it for the Messianic redemption is quite essential. Coming from the heights of sublime speculation and drinking from the springs of mystical experience, it nevertheless descends into all the depths of Jewish life and seeks to determine not only the life of the initiated few, but as far as possible that of every Jew. And for a long time she succeeded in this to an astonishing degree. Yeah, so what is this? What then becomes this, what could be reached by so many people in the Jewish communities? This is this idea of the Tzimtzum, the beginning in which God creates the whole creation going back, just retiring himself one step back, allowing an empty space to be there, allowing the existence of the world. And so in the Lurianic Tzimtzum, what is totally new and different from the tradition is that God takes himself not into a place but away from a place. If we look to the descriptions as an example in the book of Moses, we will see that God will say, I will go into one place. He goes into a place. But in the Lurianic Kabbalah, God goes away from place. And so, for Isaac Luria, the Tzimtzum is no longer the concentration of God in a particular place, but in contrary, it's the withdrawal from a place in God's own center. And he writes, it's literally that God go in the midst of himself, going away from the place. It's a retreat, and in Isaac's Luria Tzimtzum, Gershom Scholem says, if the self-limitation of God before creation. Tzimtzum, the self-limitation and the withdrawal of God as the precondition for creation. So the first step of God is to allow the creation to become. And Scholem writes, the first of all acts is therefore not an act of revelation, but an act of concealment and restriction. Only in the second act does God step out of himself with a ray of his essence and begins his revelation or his unfolding as Creator God, in that primordial space which he created in himself. So there are two steps. The first is going away, allowing something to become. And then God can reveal himself in that what then became. Yeah, this was this main idea of this beginning out of nothing. And then as Gershom Scholem describes in this Kabbalah of Isaac Luria, we have also the messianic view on this far future of the tikkun, of the realization of all healing and all what went apart coming together. I would like, in this short description as an introduction to what will come now, to finish this with some words also from this speech that Gershom Scholem gave in the 30th day after Franz Rosenzweig's death, and that he held at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, because here he says something that is, I would say, also true for himself, for the way he lived for decades with the search of knowledge of this huge, huge treasure that he could reveal and make visible for the further generations to come. And here in this speech he says that during the time in which Franz Rosenzweig in the First World War was in Macedonia in the war, participating into the war, from there he wrote, he sent letters, and in these letters he claims that there is a call for founding a new academy for the science of Judaism. A new academy for the science, for the knowledge of Judaism, and we will hear, I will quote immediately, as an organ for the renewal of that what lives from Israel in Germany. And then Gershom Scholem says they all heard this call, and it was a call for a new Jewish education. A Jewish education and for an institution that would have teachers that are researchers, and these teacher researchers would have a very, very specific relation to that what they would teach and research about. And I would like to read this quote, first the whole, and then I will underline the last lines again. So, while Franz Rosenzweig was at war in Macedonia, we first heard him calling for the founding of an academy for the science of Judaism as an organ for the renewal of Israel in Germany. All of us who were in Germany at the time still remember how this appeal in his open letter to Hermann Cohen, which appeared under the title It's Time, penetrated the hearts of many. He called for a new Jewish education and for an institution that would train teacher researchers in whom the accuracy of insight and the depth of knowledge could be combined with the alertness of the heart for the demands of the time for a living education. He called for a new education and for an institution that would train teacher researchers in whom the accuracy of insight and the depth of knowledge could be combined with the alertness of the heart for the demands of the time for a living education. Yeah, I would like now to close this consideration, this short consideration about this research of Gershom Scholem on this theme of the creation out of nothing. And now I would give the word to Peter Selg, who will then bring us into the life and the world of Gershom Scholem. Thank you very much.
Yes, part two, today here in Edith Marian's house, and as Constanza said, we had it last week on the birthday of Gershom Scholem in front of the statue in the Goethe-Ahnung, the representative of mankind, in German, and now for you in English. And as Constanza Kaliks said, part of this serial of lectures about Hebrew Jewish humanism, another contribution about one of the most intellectual and moral prominent figures of the beginnings in Israel. This Gershom Scholem, quite a famous and now international famous researcher, as we heard. And for us here, it is not only of historical interest, it is of Michaelic interest, I would say. In the general anthroposophical section, as some of you know, we are mainly interested in Dr. Steiner's own research, but not only. So to ask, where are other Michaelic impulses at the dawn of a new age during the 20th century? And so we concentrated since some years on the Jewish contribution, and also always with a look or with a kind of attention to Israel. So it's not independent of what is going on in the country, and especially also today, because, and this is different from Rosenzweig or some others, even Paul Celan was only a visitor to Israel. Only is not a good word for him, because he was deeply moved when he came to Israel once and met many people from his home in Czernowitz, Bukowina. So it was also for Celan, it was facing the sphere and the homeland of parents and the whole family. It was not a visitor, as maybe other people come as visitors. But, and I think we all feel it if we come to Israel or only from the distance. This is an enormous difference to all those who live there and have another experience of the reality of the country and the struggle and the tension. So if we hear now a bit about the life story of Gershom Scholem, it is an insight into the reality of a biography in Jerusalem after the age of 25. He was so young when he came, and in a way he kept loyal. We will hear that he lost some of his dreams about cultural Zionism, but he kept loyal in a way to the task he came into the country. And I also would say he kept loyal to a seed of hope for the future. It is not so easy to to bring this now in 50 or even 60 minutes, because it's an enormous complex life story and more than 84 years. And I don't want to simplify. And I'm not an expert as well for Gershom Scholem, but I hope that this coming together is an element or a seed of hope in itself. So the concentration on him and his life work is also a contribution for the future. And for us here, facing the coming 100-year death day of Dr. Steiner, it is also, from a different point of view, a challenge. There is also a spiritual heritage of Steiner. It is of course not from the Middle Age, and we don't have to go out in the world to find the manuscripts. They are all here in Rudolf Steiner archive. But how to handle a spiritual heritage, how to develop a research attitude, and also, I would say, a scientific attitude with a kind of empathy and distance to handle anthroposophy, or, as Constanza Kaliks said, to open it for the future, for the coming generations. We can't only repeat Dr. Steiner had said, or we can't only go on with traditions or modes of to live anthroposophy. This is the one part. It's very important to live the substance of anthroposophy. But from a scientific point of view, it's also important how to open the spiritual heritage. Now we know it is more almost completed. The collected works of Dr. Steiner, more than 440 books. Who is the one to say, I know the content? Or who is the one to say, I see the lines, the context, the whole? So I just want to mention this last point, that for us it is also a basic need. We have here a very modest school for spiritual science, but this is spiritual science of anthroposophy. And it is a task for the further generations to keep it going, or even to improve it, but on a level of a school. And so we are still the beginners. But this was also all the time the life mood of Gershom Scholem, that he on his own path with another heritage is on the onset. And he hoped all the time that there will be followers, pupils, next generations. Now I'll go a little bit into the biography, which is a one from Berlin to Jerusalem and partly back to Berlin, never going back in the sense of settlement. But it was deeply touching that he became ill in Germany, in Berlin, end of 1981, in a special situation. I would not say that he became ill because of Germany, but it's interesting that he was almost at home from his beginnings. And I will tell you a little bit more about it. So we heard from Constanza that he was born just at the end of the 19th century, the end of a dark period, as Dr. Steiner outlined from a spiritual point of view, even if we could say there was no century as dark as the 20th century. Steiner would maybe say that's right, but the 20th century, in a way, had a strange destiny of balancing up the thoughts of the 19th. That means that dead thoughts culminating in the 19th century, they had its results in the 20th, the genocidal and other results, but there was a certain lowest point of spiritual development or non-development in the 19th. And at the end of the dark time, Gershom Scholem was born, as we heard. It was the 5th of December, and therefore we had the commemoration last week. Or was it this week? So the days are so full. It was in fact this week, I think on Tuesday, but okay, forget about it. In the middle of Old Berlin, as the 4th youngest son of a Jewish family who originally came from what we call Silesia, Glogau in particular, and they left their homeland, so this is East Germany, the eastern part of Germany, Silesia, and went to Berlin, to the growing capital, at the beginning of the 19th century. 3 generations, and in this course of the 3 generations, as Gershom said, they lost all their religion. Or better to say, it was a kind of a process of a total assimilation. From an orthodox onset to total assimilation. They never became Christians, the parents, but they behaved as, including the Christmas tree. But more important for Gershom, denying in a way their Jewish background. Only, he said, a person without a Jewish childhood, he grew up. Maybe you are interested in the profession of the father. He was interesting concerning the son. He was a book printer. And really, Gershom Scholem, he was a reader and a writer. So there was a family tradition of book printing, and the oldest 2 brothers took over the enterprise of the father, but not Gershom, the youngest, and not his second youngest brother, Werner, who became an extreme left-winged fighter, at this time fighter for justice. We can have many discussions about socialism and so on, but we should have in mind there was a time when socialism was a question of morality. Especially in Middle Europe, I would say. I can only judge it for Middle Europe, Germany, Austria. There was a socialism of the heart and a moral fighter. And Werner Scholem died in the concentration camp of Buchenwald, was murdered there. So these 2 youngest brothers, they went out of this, I would say, successful way of becoming a German nationalist, and they were never rich, the parents, but it was middle class and totally assimilated. Good Germans. And for Gershom, this was horror. This was, in fact, and at this time when he was 13, this was his rebellion. Rebellion of the denial of Judaism. And he came to this inner conviction mainly when he came across a book, when he was 13 years old, so the Bar Mitzvah time, a book about the history of the Jews, a very famous book at this time from Heinrich Graetz. And I mean, he had a kind of a fire of a historian in his soul. He could research history to a degree that it became totally full of life. Gershom Scholem had the possibility to bring the so-called history in the present. And not only the thoughts, but also those who created the thoughts. He also designed a lot of biographies. We heard about Isaac Luria in Safed, and many other personalities by Gershom Scholem's book. A kind of a resurrection. That's how I met Scholem as a medical student when I came across his books. He not at all, no Jewish background, no Jewish family, nothing. But I realized that these books, they talked to me. It was a voice. And not only a voice of thoughts, also a voice of destinies, a very special type of the so-called past. When he was 13 years old and he faced this book, he had a feeling that there is, as Constanza said, a long history. It is a stream of culture, a spiritual stream as well. And he grew up in a family where this is more or less denied. And he started in a very radical way. I don't know another example as him to learn Hebrew, but 15 hours a week. And with the best teachers he found out in Berlin, rabbis and so on. The language first, but in parallel the writings. And 13 years of age, Steiner said in some of his educational talks that this is a time when destiny is penetrating the biography of an individuality. So if we enter puberty, we enter also our destiny in a different way than as a child. So good for him was a huge library of the Jewish community, if you know Berlin, Oranienburger Straße, near the prominent synagogue in our time. I was still a child, he said. And the discovery was the language, the writings, and the contemporary Zionism. I mean, in 1911, this is the year when he became 13 and 14 then, Zionism played a role. So you know about Theodor Herzl and the whole movement around him. And philosophers and teachers at Martin Buber and others were part of this movement. And it was almost a youth movement. Even if Martin Buber seems to be older than the other ones, in his heart he was quite young. So he faced also the Zionism movement, which was not at all mainly a political movement. It's not for a state or a nation. It was, for Scholem's perception, more or less a movement for a cultural, spiritual, moral rebirth of Judaism. By a quotation, committing to Zionism was for me a moral and emotional decision, a reaction that had to do with truthfulness. Truthfulness was not expressed in the desire for a state, but in rebellion against the lie that Jewish existence actually was. So, as a young man with 14, 15 years, and quite typical for that age, the parents are living in a life lie. But in this kind, the lie was the denial. So he was studying Herzl and Nordau and Pinsker and Hesse and Nathan Birnbaum, if you know these prominent Zionist writers, and always had a photograph of Theodor Herzl in the forthcoming years in his study rooms. Enormous discussion with his father, who wanted to be a German and a patriot and full of distance to this Zionist movement. But he had this son, unfortunately. I wanted to find a way to the sources back. I wasn't satisfied with just reading about things. I wanted to know who the Jews were and are. He wondered that these people, with this long history, they are still there and standing. So he asked himself, what are the driving forces for this enormous vitality? And this is not a physical question for him, not a biological, but it was mainly a moral, spiritual question. this capacity, this virtue of standing upright. And he had the feeling from the beginning it has to do with the spiritual sources. With the spiritual sources. And what he realized in this first book, Heinrich Grätz and some other, the official writing of Judaism by German Jews was denying an enormous important part of the Jewish history, and this is what we heard about the Kabbalah and the Zohar. So this esoteric line, this highly spiritual esoteric trait, this was by reasons of political correctness a little bit made smaller or even brought out of the public presentation of Judaism. So he was extremely interested in the spiritual flow, or the covered or the hidden Judaism, and he did it, with an enormous courage and will involvement. Good to know that this was not at all because of anti-Semitic situation. He said, I did not face them at school. This was not at all my driving force. But when I realized the importance of Judaism, I was then beginning to study anti-Semitic writings, what kind of offendings. So when he was also 15 years old, he started to research for these anti-Semitic writings at this time. And later on he said that he was reading journals in which everything was propagated clearly and unmistakably, which 20 years before Hitler came to power, which the Nazis later put into practice. And he said later, I had the feeling that this will come. This was not the driving force of my going to Israel or to Palestine at this time. But I had it in mind, of course. Also very fascinating for this early awakening was his clear perception of the destructive power of the First World War, which is for us not difficult to state. But those who were involved, the majority in all countries, had the feeling they are fighting for the good. It was in Germany the case, but also in France and also in Russia. So propaganda is always a very effective tool of convincing people that they are fighting for the good, without any alternative. And unfortunately, a spiritual teacher, moral teacher, as Martin Buber, for 2 years, he was following this German propaganda. And there were articles in the Jewish journals saying, yes, we are good soldiers for Germany, and we are convinced that we are doing the good. But Gerd Schomm had the feeling it's mass murdering. And he started to publish an underground newspaper with a friend and fighting against this false interpretation of war with anti-war articles. He was expelled from school because he wrote also to an official Jewish magazine a public letter against this propaganda. And he asked for signatures by the classmates. But unfortunately, it was found, this paper, in his school bag and brought to the director. So the director or the school leading committee, after discussion with his father, thrown him out of the school. But because the director and some of the teachers saw that he's a brilliant boy in mathematics, in other types of sciences, they wanted also to protect him partly, and so in the leaving school paper, it's only said that he will leave school to continue his education privately. So there was no reason named. And this was the possibility to go directly to university. There was a special little law that he could start to study philosophy, to study at without having the matura. So he started with 17 years with philosophy and mathematics. Mathematics because he was very talented, and a lot of enormous Jewish thinkers are also mathematicians, but he also had in mind that maybe if he's going to Palestine, maybe they need math teachers more than philosophers. So maybe he will have a kind of income there. So this was in his mind. For father, a catastrophe that his boy was thrown out of school because of propaganda anti-war. He was absolutely a nationalist, as I said. So it was this horrible son. So he did his studies at university and had to leave home. Father sent him a letter saying, "You are no more allowed to live in my apartment or in my house." So he thrown him out second time, not only the school, but also father. Very interesting, the letter and so on, but it's not our major theme. A typical but a radical conflict, father and son. So the good thing was that he was living in a little hotel is not the right name, a little home place where many Eastern Jewish thinkers got home. In Berlin, philosophers, writers. So maybe he ended not by accident there and met a lot of very important people for his future in this little home place there. And he went on at university. He finished his school, of course, did the matura, and went on in his Hebrew studies, mystic studies, Kabbalah studies, but also poetry studies. And he was very fascinated still by Buber, especially also because Buber brought this Eastern Europe heritage, which they called Hasidism, so the last mystic big stream in the 18th century, more or less in Poland. And at the beginning, Scholem was quite fascinated by Buber's writing, but as time went on and he was a little bit getting skeptical because Buber made his own thing out of this Hasidism and had the feeling that he is a little bit transforming it into poetry or world literature, but the core of the Hasidism, the esoteric core also, which was for Scholem, after some research, a messianic element and an apocalyptic element, had to do with the Kabbalah. Also Buber was a little bit, made it smaller than it in fact was. So he was a little bit skeptical if Buber is a real scientist or is more a poet and a moral philosopher than a scientist of Judaism, at least concerning Hasidism and Kabbalah, apart from their distance in the judgment of the war. But very interesting, when Buber came across one of the articles of Jan Gershom about him negatively and about the war, he invited him to come to his home in Berlin. He was living in Zellendorf and was incredibly friendly and totally interested. And Scholem said he was so open and interested in me and encouraged my studies and asked if I would take part in a new journal Buber was designing. And this was more or less their lifelong relationship. I mean, there's a lot to say about Buber and Scholem in Jerusalem, but always Gershom Scholem had a high respect to the spiritual and moral statue of Martin Buber and to the human moral qualities and the kind of criticism about him as a researcher, especially in Kabbalah and Jewish mystics. So there was a certain tension, but it was typical for Scholem that he kept his high respect, even if he criticized, sometimes quite openly, Martin Buber, still in Jerusalem when they were old. But the same typical for Buber, to have this enormous world-breathing capacity and seeing Scholem in his uniqueness, even if sometimes his opinions or the way to express them was quite radical and offending and sometimes also hurting people. The life became even more dramatic when his brother Werner was first time arrested in a demonstration against the war. But he demonstrated not only in 1917, by the way, but with the uniform of the German army. And it was the birthday of the German Kaiser, the emperor. So a demonstration against the German government in the uniform of the army. So Werner had to go for 9 months to prison, and it became even more difficult with his father, because Gershom partly took the position of the brother Werner. And this was in fact the moment when he had to leave house. It was not directly after dismissal of the school, but now when he took the position also, the anti-war position, or was fighting or at least taking the position of the brother, he had to go. And to this very wonderful little boarding house where he met for the first time Salman Rubashov. So people of Israel know him, but with the name of Sazar, one of the presidents of the later Israel. But he also met there Agnon, the famous Jewish writer, and some other people. But then the army came as well and said, "You are old enough," and they took Gershom as well for military service in 1917, mid of the year. And for him it was very difficult. Later on he said, "I wanted to learn to shoot. I wasn't a pacifist, but I didn't want to fight for Germany." And he was obviously quite resistant in the army service. I rebelled against everything that was happening there. And it's not clear in the biographies if he really only behaved as Gershom Scholem, resisting, or if he simulated a kind of a psychological disease. But they had the feeling he is mad, or at least mentally handicapped, or better to say ill. And what they did, they took him into a hospital, a mental hospital for examination, and after 6 weeks of examination they came to a diagnosis. At this time psychiatry called it dementia praecox. Today they would say schizophrenia. And they asked for the father. This was quite good. This is a kind of modern psychotherapy, and they blamed the father, that his family conflicts played an enormous role in this destruction of the personality of the son. So father was quite impressed, but then met Gershom, and my father did not know whether to believe the diagnosis and the negative prophecies of my doctor, or to trust my talent. At the end he decided to trust the talent of the son, maybe not the talent of simulation, but also the talent in general. And we didn't talk about Zionism anymore. So this theme was now behind them, and he supported Gershom going back to university, which was now University of Jena, former place of Friedrich Schiller. And so he went on with his studies, and later on they said to him he is permanently unfit for war service, and this was for him the chance to leave Germany and going to Switzerland, which was at this time going into paradise. Okay, we can say still today, but it's not the same. At this time, a lot of young people would like to go to Switzerland, but unfortunately they had to go to the army. But he had this wonderful medical diagnosis, and he could leave Switzerland, Germany, going to Switzerland, but not in the nowhere, not to Dornach, or he went directly to Bern because a friend of him, the closest friend ever, was studying there. We know him quite well, Walter Benjamin, and his young wife Dora, and they were deeply befriended since Berlin. This is another long story, not of the evening talk, but they studied together there, partly at the University Bern, but partly they had a private university, only 2 persons. Gershom said, University Muri. This is a little part of the Bern village where they both lived, and they had there the learning together in Judaism, but also mainly in German literature, Franz Kafka, and many other topics. I left my childhood with Germany. At university he heard Aristotle, good to know. He also learned Arab language and studied a lot. I mean, this is not my main topic, but the library of Gershom Scholem was growing. In Berlin, then the war ended and the revolution came. Good to know is that he second time came into contact with Jews from East Europe. Young Jewish people came to Bern from Czechoslovakia, from Poland, from other countries, and they were on the way to Paris, to now we are in 1919, to these negotiations after war, and they wanted, and they were the delegates of the Jewish congregations of their countries to fight for the wars, for the rights of the Jewish congregations in the countries. And he felt in their, in meeting them, totally beautiful. He sent in a letter at home and saying that it's so easy to be together with them. For him it was more regional. With this kind of Judaism they were living coming from the East. I can talk to these people and we immediately have our common center. And one of these people was quite important for the Goetheanum. Was Hugo Bergmann. He came from Prague. He knew Rudolf Steiner, and in fact when he met Scholem in Bern, he directly came from a conversation with Steiner in Bern. Steiner gave a lecture for the workmen in Bern about threefolding, and had a 45 minutes conversation with Hugo Bergmann. He knew him quite well from Prague. He also Steiner knew that he's a Zionist and a very promising young man, a philosopher, of course a mathematician, as those clever people. And so I don't think that at this time Bergmann told Scholem that he's coming from Steiner, but later on he heard a lot about Steiner by Bergmann. But interesting that both of them remarked this encounter in letters or in diaries, and it's very interesting how they experienced the other spirit, very positively. But just to mention it, later on they lived in one house in Jerusalem. They were both professors at the university, the Hebrew University, and it was even more intimate, the connection, but this is not my topic here. And Bergmann was very fascinated how such a young man with no Jewish roots, I mean roots in the family, with this radical drive. He could not believe, never met such a young man as Schröer with this knowledge and with this total commitment. And when Schröer said to Bergman that he will maybe now focus all his academic studies to the Kabbalah and to make a PhD about the Kabbalah and the esoteric center of Middle Age Judaism, he was very fascinated. And that's what then Schröer did. He went to Munich, where there was the biggest collection of old handwritings, Kabbalistic handwritings, and made a PhD about the oldest one. Very interesting. And he had the possibility to work with the oldest manuscript from, it is 1298. So the end of the 13th century, but the original was in Munich. So he had a chance to work on a PhD with the original manuscripts and created his first book, by the way. But so he lived in Munich, met Max Brod, the close friend to Kafka, and it was an interesting time, but also he met the beginning National Socialist movement. So in 1920, 1921, 1922, we know it from our anthroposophical history that the first attacks against Steiner were done by the National Socialists in Munich, which was a center for the extreme right-wing, aggressive national socialist movement. And he experienced it. One time also wrote a letter at home saying that he had a kind of a fight on the street with such a fanatical anti-Semitic person. He decided to do the PhD and then to go to Israel, and that's what he did. There were some other, went back to Berlin and then went to Frankfurt, met Franz Rosenzweig and gave lessons, but I will overjump this and now coming to Israel or Palestine at this time. So it was in summer 1923, when he came to the country, 20th of September, Yom Kippur. The same day the ship came to Jaffa, to the harbor of Jaffa. The library came a different way. So 2,000 books were sent from Hamburg, his small library. When Gershom Scholem died, he had 20,000 books. I mean, maybe some of us have 20,000 books, but a mixture of everything. But he had a specific library for Jewish heritage. And the center was Kabbalah. He was a collector of manuscripts and books in all the old books in Jerusalem now, but later on in London and in Munich. So 2,000 books were sent from Hamburg to Palestine, but when he died, he gave his whole library with 20,000 books to the Hebrew University. It is still there, of course, Scholem's library. It's a long story with his books. We come back to his coming to the country, Yom Kippur. And he was at this time already engaged. His girlfriend Escha, from a Hamburg Jewish family, already was in the country, and both with the help of Hugo Bergman. Because it was not so easy to come in. You need a kind of not only invitation, but also a kind of a contract or a promise to work and so on. I'm not specialist for it, but I know that he had a kind of a license by Hugo Bergman. At this time, he was the leader of the National Library of Jerusalem. He was already the chief of the library in Prague before, so he shifted to Jerusalem, but he was mainly for the Zionist organization, Bergman, responsible for the education department. So just to mention that there is a letter from Bergman to Steiner before he went to Palestine, when Bergman said to Steiner, I will be responsible or co-responsible for the education. And there is a chance to bring the principle of the threefoldness in the new state. It is not my topic tonight, but it is important to know that for a person as Hugo Bergman, and differently, but also for Gershom Scholem, this was a possibility to shape a new society. Also in the relationship between economy, rights, and spiritual life. So threefoldness. And the first article about social threefolding was published by Bergman in Hebrew in Jerusalem. And before he left to Palestine, he said goodbye to Steiner in Dornach. And Steiner showed him the Goethe Ahnung. So later on he tried to convince Gershom Scholem that there's something true essential in anthroposophy, which was not so much a deep interest of Gershom Scholem, but they remained neighbors and they went together till the end, both of them. And so he came into the country, prepared this kind of coming to the country since many years. He was so young, 25, I said. And now there was a difficult decision because he got directly an offer to become a math teacher in the training college for Jewish teachers. And he loved mathematics. But he also got by Bergman a possibility to become the head of the Hebrew and Judaic department of the National Library. I think it's quite clear what kind of decision was done by Scholem. I mean, he loved education, but library for him, he could not resist, of course. In a letter he's sending to Germany, he said, I'm the head of the Hebrew department of the National and University Library. There was no university existing, but it was the intention, which serves, very interesting, the explanation, the library serves as preparation for the great academic work that is to be associated with the reconstruction of the Holy Land by Jewish hands. So he had this very optimistic, you can say, vision that a library could be an important tool for academic work. This is clear, but this academic work should be associated or imbuing the reconstruction of the Holy Land by Jewish hands and the realization of Zionism. Later on, decades later, when they asked him, wasn't it an illusion? Because now the last 15 or 20 minutes we will hear a little bit about also his kind of depressions, because the reality was quite difficult in Palestine. And so they asked him later, was it an illusion? And he said, you know, I immigrated because I believed that there was no hope except here. I had no certainty that this work would succeed here. I did not know whether Zionism would take a political or an apolitical direction. I was pessimistic about the Zionist cause, but I wished its success. That is, I wanted and I needed to be in the land of Israel. One had to have at least tried. There is no other way. And if you, at this time in 1923, he said to the reporter, the journalist, if you had asked me, do you expect and want to build a new society? Is that more important to you? The creation of a living social organism? Or does the political framework seem more important to you? No doubt. I would have answered, you as a young man, and as I do today, the former is more important. For me, the former, that means, and his own words, a creation of a new living social organism. It's very interesting. He's using Bergmann's terminus of social organism. He's using at least a word, a living social organism. And so he was finally in the country, and he directly married his girlfriend. They were so young, on his birthday in 1923. Father sent a letter saying, what you're doing there, you will get no financial support from me, and so on. Still the same refusing, it was not his own path. And maybe good to say that he met a lot of people, again from Berlin, a lot of these Zionist friends who immigrated so early, and he also met the last Kabbalists in the old city of Jerusalem. Sometimes I took part in their prayers, which were very impressive. So Jerusalem in 1923 in summer, also an important year for our society here, and we talked a lot about 1923, 1924 in the last years, in the 100-year rhythm of time. Now we are in Jerusalem, and he met the last Kabbalists. His brother, beloved brother Werner, became in Germany a deputy for the Communist Party in the German parliament. So a very extreme way as well. And they kept their relationship. And what he saw is that the country, back to Palestine, is developing. And he visited a lot of friends now living in kibbutzim, and he gave his first lecture about Zohar and Kabbalah in the kibbutz of this early time in Palestine. And he was totally impressed by the sense of brotherhood, by this new relationship to money or to economy, because they shared their lives and they had no private property. And there was something in living together. He said later, we never used a hotel because we always knew somebody where we could stay for a night. And if you came home at this time, there was somebody, another friend lying in your own bed. So it was clear that the doors are open. You can say this is a kind of an idealistic element, but it was real. But on the other side, he sent a letter to another German friend saying it's an apocalyptic country. It's in 24, 17th of December 24, when Steiner was publishing the leading thoughts of December 24, he said it's an apocalyptic country. I belong most firmly to the sect of those who adhere to apocalyptic opinions about what will be the fate of the Zionist movement here. And he's also saying that you can indeed say anything about a new Palestine if you want to understand me correctly, and especially bad things. But that more is happening here than in other corners of the earth seems to be necessary to admit. He saw from the beginning the huge tensions, challenges, but also the chances. He was disappointed, but mainly, he said, by the intellectual level of many of the Jews living in the country, who were also not deeply interested in the source of Judaism, in the spiritual sources. So in a way, he thought he will be at home in this search, but he was not. And even when they started the institute, so the academic institution, so they opened the Hebrew University 1st of April 25. Steiner died the 30th of March 25, and they opened without any relation to our local history, 1st of April. And before some weeks before or 3 months before, in Steiner's lifetime, they opened an institute for Jewish studies, first of all, which was a kind of a seat of the university, or the exact translation of the name of the institute from the Hebrew is Institute for the Sciences of Judaism, with all these hopes for a renewal, cultural, spiritual, intellectual center. It was very small. They rented a house. They had no money, no millions to, but they rented a house on Mount Scopus and started the institute. But Scholem was convinced that this will be the seed of a possible future, and also creating a new image of Jewish history. Now you can say history is just history or anthroposophical history, but if you have a wrong image of history or a deformed image, then you have not the ground to build the future. For Scholem, it was essential to have an appropriate image of your own history or of the history of your spiritual movement. And he said this will play the center for studies in the sense of Achat Ha'am, which is another pioneer of Jewish thoughts in these years, a kind of a certain polarity to Martin Buber, but also partly a befriended one. And so 3 months later, 4 months later, they had the opening of the university with a wonderful speech of Bialik, a Jewish writer, and saying there will be a complete new house of learning. And interesting for us, and also maybe for the Goetheanum, it was originally meant to be first of all a place for research, and then for teaching later, if something is really researched. So they didn't start directly with conferences, but first of all with research, a research place which should become an education home, also in the sense of Franz Rosenzweig, we heard about it. And after the beginning of the university, Scholem, who was still part of the library, wrote a letter to Bialik, which is quite famous now, where he proposed his own plans for researching the Kabbalah. And he explained what has to be done in a huge project. And at the end of this letter, he's saying, you know, I do not have the freedom to withdraw from this work. He said more or less, I'm not convinced that I will fulfill it, but I can't withdraw. It has to be done. And Bialik, the writer who was in the leading committee of the university, said, we need you, absolutely. I place my trust in you that you will certainly carry it out and that you will certainly succeed. You are the man who will find the lost key to the locked gate of the palace of Kabbalah at the end of your work. If only I could find people among us who can support you, then, he said, then the hidden fruit in the depth of this field of research could come to surface. And other people, as you, committed to the work, dedicating their work. And so at the end of this letter, this answer of Bialik, he said, so long may your hand never tire of knocking at the closed gate of the palace of Kabbalah. To everyone who knocks, it will be opened. And so he became an appointment as lecturer at the new institute, which was the beginning of his academic career in Israel. And he started with a lecture, an opening inaugural lecture about the author of the book of Zohar. Now I have to summarize more than 5 decades of life. First point, the situation was difficult, but it was scary. But at the end of the 20s, 28, when here the Goetheanum was opened, the second, especially exactly in this autumn, 28, the conflicts, especially in Jerusalem itself, between a fraction of the Arabs and a fraction of the Jewish population, they increased. And around the holy sites, Klagemauer, Morning Wall, in the center, and it became very aggressive. And in 29, many people died. And Scholem became a politician. He belonged to what we call the Brit Shalom movement. This was a movement, I think it was started in 25, of this cultural and spiritual and moral rebirth of Judaism and friendship with the Arab neighbors. And now he became a fighter for this neighborhood, became more or less a politician. So in the diary Hugo Bergman says the most active in Brit Shalom is Scholem, who has become quite a politician. And even more extreme in his views than he used to be. So he was always kind of a radical. But he went out in the country to the kibbutz and so on and other places. He was the soul of the activity. He had a feeling now it is open. Later on, he said, there was a sensitive period in the 20s where the things could be shaped in a good way. For half a year he didn't touch any more his studies, which means a lot for a person as Scholem. And of course he saw that, and everybody could see it, there was quite a big party of revisionists. They want to have the whole country only for the Jews. And a lot of Orthodox, almost fanatical Jews, with a kind of a Zionist messianic element, but they turned it into political. I mean, Scholem, during his whole lifetime, with the seed of his soul, he had a messianic element. But he said it's incredibly dangerous to turn it into politics and to try to a political realization of messianism. This is the most dangerous development. This kind of nationalist thinking, and he was really fighting. It was also not easy at university because there was at least one chairman from modern Hebrew literature. His name was Joseph Klausner, and he was also a revisionist. And he was fighting, let's say, against a professorship for Yiddish, because he said we only need a modern Hebrew language here in the service of the state. So all our studies here, they serve the state, the nation, but in a nationalistic sense. So not a free school for science, but a servant of the state. Even if there was no state of Israel at this time, but this man, Klausner, but only to mention him, it was not the incarnation of evil, by the way, but only to say that even also the university was not a pure place for Brit Shalom. And Brit Shalom, as far as I understood, is not meaning no army at all. As far as I understood, Scholem and also Bergman, they were for the Haganah, that means for this kind of Jewish underground army needed to protect partly themselves, but they were strongly fighting against terrorist attacks from the Arab and the Jewish side. But they lost. And we have letters from Scholem from 1930 where he's saying, the dream is out. The dream is out. it's death. It's a wound. The dream turned into violence. The Zionist dream turned into violence. Zion is lost. The spiritual center failed. It's over. The vivid moment in history is past. And now it's a long time to talk then about the 30s, and in Germany Hitler came and his brother was arrested and 7 years of concentration camp. And it is in the same year, 1923, he became finally Professor Gershom Scholem for Jewish mystic and Kabbalah. So it was the first one, because this discipline was a creation out of nothing. If I want to take over the terminus we had in the first part of the evening. So he created something anew, but the country was partly fading away. And in Europe, it is becoming from year to year more difficult, or for the Jews. And the family was still there. And father died just before the academic career of his son started. But brother was in prison or concentration camp. Mother was always taking care for the brother, visited him in prison, and waited long time with the emigration. In 1939, she escaped to Australia, and both brothers escaped. But Werner, as I mentioned, was murdered then, but in 1940 in Buchenwald, close to Weimar. He trying to convince Buber to come. It is time to come. Buber waited long time. He saw his major task in Germany very long. And there's a wonderful letter when Buber became 60. It is in February 1938 to Heppenheim, where Buber lived. It's nearby Darmstadt. He did not say you have to come, but it's a wonderful letter in letting him free, but also on the other side saying how Buber is needed. When we think of you now, our eyes are focused on what is to come, as is certainly not the case with 60-year-olds. I wish you with all my heart that it may be granted to you to stand here in your place in the struggle of these coming years. We do not need to doubt your strength for this very battle, but we are impatient to see you use them. Buber was already 60, but Scholem knew he was younger, and he was the hope. And finally he came then in March 38. But we know the history, what happened in those years. To summarize, there was an increasing violence in Palestine, also with terror groups, also from the Jewish side, which was horrible for Scholem, Irgun, or the other groups, Lehi, but also Arab terror groups. And so it was an increasing violence, and at the same time the Nazi regime started to exterminate the Jewish population and started the Second World War. So an incredible difficult situation. And they were not so far away, the Nazis, because maybe you know a little bit about the military story. Rommel, the leading German military guy there in Africa, they were finally stopped, but it was not so far away from Palestine, El Alamein, this famous battle, but it was in November 1942. They were on the way to Palestine, the German army. So they were, as Hannah Arendt said, you are not secure in Palestine if you are Jews. There is no secure spot on the earth, also not Palestine. But it was, of course, a release that they were stopped, the Germans, And now it seems, as Scholem writes in a letter to Hannah Arendt, she's already in New York, it seems if the miracle will come true and Palestine will be spared, but everything else will be destroyed. That is and remains unthinkable. We are at the end of 1942, and this is the year where the Holocaust became a theme also in Palestine. So there were clear informations what is going on in Auschwitz, Birkenau, in Lublin, in Majdanek, in the other places. And Buber, together with Magnus and Bergman, they organized demonstrations because they wanted to have more activities coming also from Palestine or from this Jewish government. It was not a real government. They had their leaders, Ben-Gurion and others, to save the European Jews. But there was not enough interest or enough courage, or there was maybe no clear knowing what to do. But they wanted to wake up the people. And it's interesting that Scholem was not part of this group anymore. And also there was then a political founding of a new party, as if he would have lost hope that there is a political option. And a very melancholic, it was not a speech. After 20 years of opening the institute, he made a kind of balancing. It was not a speech because he never give this speech, but he published this ungiven talk in a journal where he's balancing up his work or the work of this institute since 20 years. And now it's not the time to go deep into this lecture, but saying we did not reach our goals until now. And now the Jews are killed in Europe. They won't come and support, and we did this work also for them. And so in a way, not only the situation in Palestine was difficult, but also those for whom the international Jewish community was fading away, or better to say was killed, at least in Europe. So a very, very a 0 point. And there are diary entries of Scholem, very dark. So December 1944, is it true that God appears in the abandonment of a collapsed life? Why then is everything so completely dark, hopeless and distorted in my life? And for me it was very astonishing that in fact Gershom Scholem, after the end of the war, went on. If we talk today about Gershom Scholem and his spiritual work and his major books and his research, the majority was done after the war. He started earlier, of course, and his books about major traits in mystic Judaism was an early one. But I don't know how he resurrected. I don't know how he overcame this enormous dark time. In 1946, he was invited to go to Europe from a US organization to collect all the remaining books of the former libraries, the Jewish libraries in Prague, in Berlin, and for months he traveled around Europe, the destroyed Middle Europe, the destroyed Berlin. He saw his house of the childhood, his school, is what all destroyed. But not only the buildings were destroyed, the Jews were killed, and Yeah, he tried to save the libraries, and he got a lot of books for the National Library of the Hebrew University, but in a way you could ask what for, because it's all lost. And when he came home from this trip in 1946, his second wife Fania, a Polish Jewish woman, lost a family in the Holocaust or in the Shoah, said for 1 year he was lying in bed, more or less. He couldn't work anymore. But then, again, maybe also a creation, I wouldn't say out of nothing, but he found the way back, the courage to go on with his work. Obviously, he found also a path of hope, even if so many things were falling apart, and was living in the middle of a war. Because as you know, the military, the English army left Palestine. This was in November 47, and then the war started. And the armies of Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq against the Israel army. And Jerusalem was also a center of the attacks. They were more or less isolated there, and also not a lot of food anymore there and water. He was also isolated from the university, he couldn't go out. In fact, he was reading Franz Rosenzweig's writing in this most dark period. But at the end, surprisingly enough, the Israel army won the fight. And the state was founded, and he remained very skeptical and said to his wife that this state is difficult to establish. And he said he thinks that there will be a spiritual and moral decline of the Jewish people with this state success. He was sometimes very radical, to be honest. And then he said, if one of the limbs of a sick organism is injured, all the blood flows there. And with us, all the talents and powers flow into the area of security. And that is one of the reasons for a spiritual decline. So his main concern was that if this state has the destiny to be all the times with the army and with security and to fight, then there will be no more blood as a symbol for the other tasks and virtue. But obviously, I can't judge it in detail, at a certain point he accepted this given reality. He did not become a fighter against Ben Gurion or the other persons who overtook responsibility for this new state. He kept his profession and he went on with his spiritual work. He went not only on, he went back to Europe. We heard about the Eranos lecture in Ascona, and it is surprising that from 1949, over 30 years, every summer, Gershom Scholem was part of the Monte Verita Eranos conference, which is in Ascona, so southern part of Switzerland. He came back to Europe. He was teaching in German, not in Germany, but in Switzerland, and made wonderful, he went on with his work. And maybe I should finish. He became honorary citizen of Jerusalem, and at the end of the war in 1967, the 6 Days War, he was in Europe at this time, and he was invited to give a talk in Zurich. They made a kind of a conference, or better to say, in the Zurich theater there was a rally for Israel. and he was asked for a contribution. And he started, I speak to you here as one who has lived in Israel for 45 years and has dedicated his life to the cause of the rebuilding and rebirth of the Jewish people in their old new homeland, the land of Israel. Again, he told that for him it was a moral decision, emigration, reconstruction, and overtaking responsibility for this new country, and to do all that that it's going in a good way. And he said, yes, we had many problems there, but also many achievements, and then we had to stand our ground. And then he said, but the future will not be a military one. Beyond that, it is up to us to set the forces in motion and give them shape, which are directed towards building a better future, towards self-responsibility, prudence, clarity, and peaceful coexistence in people's life. The Jews in Israel will not and cannot shirk this task. Even in a crisis such at the present time, it is immovably before our eyes. So Israel has to develop the peaceful virtues and not only the security virtues, and they are greater and ultimately more decisive than the combative ones. So he was in the middle of a very difficult situation. It is now almost 60 years ago, 57 years ago. But interesting how he ended. He said, in ancient times, Zurich theater, alchemists sat in quiet parlors to try to find and make effective the forces that transform the elements into one another. The great work in the land of Israel, with which the Jews have proved and transformed themselves, is at the same time an attempt to create human alchemy, in which hatred and enmity will one day be transformed into understanding, respect, and friendship. This is our hope. He said there is no more solution. And he repeated the year before he died, when he was asked by a journalist, where is the solution for this conflict? And he said in a very silent way, there is no solution more. So he had no solution, but still kept a seed of hope in the depth of his soul until the end. That I think he had and kept the conviction that there is at least a fertile seed for the future. And this is linked to this spiritual task. So who knows, he said, maybe it's impossible to survive crisis in another way than with this confidence of a seed. And maybe this decline which we experience is for the sake of ascent, for the ascension, for a kind of a new element. He let it open, and he said we have to keep the possibilities of history and human being open. And maybe, he said, our negative judgment is too hasty because we do not see the seeds that are hidden beneath the surface. This is, of course, not a solution for the war today, and this was also not my purpose to have a kind of a voice of Bergshom Sholem to a situation now in Israel, in Syria. But maybe it's good to know that this man who was such a researcher in spiritual things was also so much present in our times, and that this terminus, our times, is not over. So he was living in the middle of war times, not all the time, and he went on with his specific task. I don't know, but I think by spiritual experiences he got the courage to go on, even if it made obviously no direct sense, and there couldn't be a political solution coming from his institute or from his chair for Kabbalah. But I think in this stream should be part of the coming culture. So I don't think that he only researched a stream, but he allowed the stream to flow. I think what he did was, in fact, to remove the obstacles, also the obstacles of misunderstanding. And in historical research, if we remove the obstacles, the hinderings of real understanding, maybe then a kind of a spiritual energy can flow again. I don't know, because he was quite silent if you asked him about these hidden sources of his ongoing book. But from my kind of approach, I got this conviction that he was convinced that this kind of activity is also needed for a future homeland and for keeping these possibilities for the future and the human being open. So thank you all for coming together in the name or in the memory of Gershom Scholem, Gerhard Scholem in German names, but he transformed his name when he was 17 years old to Gershom, and being together with his thoughts and with his struggle, we don't know what will be the outcome, and we don't see the sense of such evenings, but all the time we still have the feeling it's necessary to do them and to trying to understand more, to commemorate, to take in mind, to take in consciousness, and to develop maybe then also moral intuitive capacities to give the right answer if we are asked in the present or in the future what we have to do. This is always a question of an intuition, and hopefully we are then a little bit prepared by those who were our forerunners, and we are standing on their shoulders, as in the school of Chartres they said that we have this background, and insofar we hope that also this evening can be a contribution to the coming peace and mutual understanding in the sense of Gershom Scholem. Thank you very much for being here in House Marian and wherever you listen to these two talks about the creation out of nothing and to the man behind the work, as far as I could sketch it. Thank you very much.